Alright, let's talk a little bit about Ipv6 Acl. So far we've only talked about the Ipv4 Acls. Now with your Ipv6 Acls, you're going to have named access control list, and they're similar in functionality to your Ipv4 extended Acls, again, but they're with the Ipv6 addressing. Make sure that when you're creating your access control list that your Ipv4 and your Ipv6 access control list cannot share the same name. Okay, so they do need to have different names, and it wouldn't hurt as you're getting used to using ACLs, and especially if you use both Ipv4 and Ipv6, if you possibly notate in the naming of your ACLs whether or not it's handling your Ipv4 addresses or your Ipv6 addresses. Some of the main differences, there's three main differences that you need to keep in mind when you're using Ipv6 ACLs is there's no wildcard mask. So with your Ipv6 addresses, you do not have a wildcard mask in your ACLs. You have additional default statements, and these default statements are your permit ICMP, any, ND, and ND is neighbor discovery, and NA is neighbor advertisement. You also have your neighbor discovery and your neighbor solicitation messages. So that's a little bit different than what you had with your Ipv6. You also, when you're applying an Ipv6 ACL, your difference there is you do Ipv6 traffic filter instead of access group. So that's also a difference that you're going to do there when you're creating your Ipv6 ACLs, because they have to discover their neighbors. Similar to your Ipv4 ACLs, you also have either the deny, the permit, or the remark, and make sure that you give the information so that you know what you're doing later. So step 1, from global config mode, you use the Ipv6 access list and then give it its list name in capitals. From there, you're going to the ACL configuration mode, you're going to use the permit or the deny statements to specify one or more conditions to determine if the packet is forwarded or dropped. Then you'll return to your privileged exec mode at that point. So here we've done the Ipv6 access list. This says no R3 LAN access, which is pretty much your description, but it's also your name. You've got your deny, your permit, and your end. Now after you created your Ipv6 ACL, you've got it configured. Now you're going to have to assign it to an interface so that it's effective on that interface. And the way you do that is you go to your interface and then you do Ipv6 traffic filter, and then you give it the name of your access control list and you tell it whether it's going to be inbound or outbound. So that's your basic differences between your Ipv6 and your Ipv4. Remember, one list per interface, per direction, per protocol. Those are the things that we need to keep in mind. So as hard as it may be to believe, or as easy as it may be to believe, depending on how you look at this particular instance here, we have a router, we have inbound and outbound Ipv4, we have inbound and outbound Ipv6. We could have a total of 8 separate ACLs applied just to this router. So you can end up with a large number of ACLs, so keep that in mind, and it's going to depend on your bandwidth and your administrator just how detailed your access control lists are going to be on your network.